And again, welcome everyone. And my name is Hazel Corcoran, and I have the pleasure of introducing our featured speaker, Christine Clark, today. First, I'd just like to take the opportunity to acknowledge the territories from which I'm joining you. It's the territories of the peoples of Treaty 7 in Southern Alberta, including the Blackfoot First Nation, tribes of Siksika, Piikani, Kainai, the Stoney Nakoda First Nations tribes, and the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and also home to the historic Northwest Métis and Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3, currently known now so-called Calgary. And in terms of introducing Christine Clark, again, it's my great pleasure to do it. Christine has been a journalist and an organic farmer, I know her in part because she has been a very valued member of the Canadian Worker Co-op Federation's JEDI Committee for Racial Justice, Equity, Diversity and Inclusion. And also her current role is as an intern with the Ontario Co-op Association. So Christine, I would turn it over to you with thanks.
Thanks very much, Hazel. And thank you for the introduction. So let's get into it. So I'm gonna share my screen and start by telling you a bit about ourselves. So we're Freedom Dreams Cooperative Education, and we're a co-op development service and a knowledge hub that shares knowledge about co-ops and the solidarity economy from a Black, Indigenous, and person of color perspective. We believe that co-ops can create equitable, sustainable, and dignified employment, that they can contribute to the economic development of BIPOC communities, and that they can foster justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion in Canada's co-op sector and within Canadian workplaces. So Hazel gave a bit of an introduction to me. I always laugh because she mentioned I was an organic farmer, and I was kind of struggling with saying is, because I used to farm on 11 acres for a nonprofit and I don't anymore. So I'm having a bit of an identity struggle with whether I could still call myself a farmer. So that's ongoing. I'm a co-op developer and educator. And Hazel mentioned that I sit on the Justice, Equity, Diversity and Inclusion Committee of the Canadian Worker Co-op Federation. I'm also on the board of directors of the local food and farm co-ops here in Ontario. And of course, I'm the co-founder of Freedom Dreams. I also always acknowledge my mother. I am the daughter of Iris, and it is in her memory that I do this work, because it is because of her example that I'm the community engaged person that I am today. I'd also like to acknowledge where I'm presenting to you from. I am in Toronto, which is the traditional lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. So let's get into our topic today. So today's keynote is bringing our whole selves to work, creating co-op culture that's welcoming to BIPOCs. What does this mean? Well, the experience of BIPOC workers is one where we feel like we can't bring our whole selves to the job. Instead, we bring parts, the ones that are deemed most appropriate or professional to predominantly white workspaces. And that often translates into leaving parts of our culture behind. Now with co-ops, with its values of democracy, equity, equality, solidarity, they hold the promise of a business model where those most marginalized at work have the decision-making power to create work cultures that uplift and empower us. And now that's great promise, it's great potential, but despite that, the Canadian co-op sector struggles to diversify its leadership or attract BIPOC membership. So where does that disconnect lay? And what approaches can we take to bridge that gap? So I'm going to talk about two ways how the co-op sector can better communicate its messaging to BIPOC entrepreneurs, BIPOC workers, and also how to create a sector-wide culture that could lead to deep and meaningful reach within BIPOC communities. I want to start by asking you a question. What is the place of co-ops in the future of work? I want you to kind of think about this question and hold it in your minds as we go through the presentation. And when we have time at the end, I'd love to hear your responses to this. And you can think about it in terms of your current work, your current studies, the research that you're doing, or maybe you could think about it in terms of the potential that you see for the co-op sector in your workplaces or communities. So that's going to be a bit of the frame of the keynote today. And I ask it because my answer comes from my lived experience. Here's a portion of a post that I wrote on Freedom Dreams Instagram, and you can follow us at Freedom Dreams Co-op. I'm just going to take a sip of water, but I'll give you a second just to glance through that. So I'm going to pull a bit from this. So these are the words of Callum Williams from The Economist, who writes that the pandemic has been a catastrophe for many, but its lasting legacy may be a better world of work. This really struck me because I would like to believe, that something positive is coming out of this current moment of crisis. But my past in work has me a bit wary of such a positive, prediction, because it has me questioning, well, a better world of work for whom? So what is that past in work that has me feeling a bit nervous? I'll give just one example, and that's code switching. From an early age, I was taught implicitly and explicitly that to succeed in Canadian workplaces, I would have to code switch. Well, what is that? Some of you may be familiar, but for those who don't, I'll get into a definition, but first I want to illustrate it with an example. So my mother, she came to this country from Trinidad and Tobago. And when I was a child, she worked as a secretary for the Ministry of Transportation. Me and my older brother, we were latchkey kids, and you might be familiar with that term, but if not, it's when kids finish school and they return home and they're temporarily unsupervised because their caregiver, their parents are still at work. So I was about, I'd say 11, 12, my brother be 13, 14. And my mom required that as soon as we reached home, that we give her a call to let her know that we're home okay. So every day after school, I would call or my brother would call and a voice would answer and we would hear Ministry of Transportation, Iris Clark speaking. And I would say, oh, hi, mommy, it's me. And immediately my mother would switch into how she naturally spoke, which is with a Trinidadian accent, which is with a Caribbean accent. As an immigrant to this country, my mother learned that in order to procure work, particularly work where you're answering phones for a government ministry, she would have to adopt a professional way of speaking, read a Canadian accent, because a professional voice wouldn't be a Caribbean or Trinidadian accent. Now, code switching has long been a strategy for Black people to successfully navigate interracial interactions. And here I'm referring to this Harvard Business Review article, The Cost of Code Switching. So I'm going to pull from this article. So code switching, it involves adjusting one's style of speech, appearance, behavior, or expression in ways that will optimize the comfort of others, read white communities, in exchange for fair treatment, quality service, and even employment advancement or opportunities. Now, Code switching, current research into it suggests that it has a psychological toll. And that includes the toll of reducing one's authentic expression. It can include hostility from within one's own community when they sense that this change is happening. And it can include a depletion of cognitive resources, including burnout, from the laborious task of having to adopt a different identity in order to navigate the everyday threats of racism and discrimination. In the HBR article, the researchers write, if leaders are truly seeking to promote inclusion and address social inequality, they must begin by understanding why a segment of their workforce believes that they cannot truly be themselves in the office. Now, code switching is only one of the things I've experienced or seen in Canadian workplaces, and I pretty much left the traditional sector feeling quite tired. And so finding relief from that psychological toll was actually one of the key reasons I came to the co-op sector, why I was drawn in. I mean, I felt burnt out. I felt like I was working my own version of Arlene Rothschild's second shift. And if you're familiar with that, Arlene Rothschild speaks about the invisible domestic labor that primarily women have to do after, their contracted jobs. But for me as a Black queer woman, I just felt like I was having to do my own version. So the jobs that I was contracted to do, plus the emotional labor of having to navigate everything from microaggressions to racially offensive or even homophobic comments masked as jokes. I see someone in the chat. I want to make sure that I'm also addressing folks in the chat. And
Christine, that was me. I was just ensuring that people who wanted to participate in French were aware they could get it, and I neglected to mention it at the beginning. I'm sorry.
Wonderful, thanks, Hazel. But if anyone has any comments in the chat, Hazel or any of our tech folks, Benedict or Aisha, I'd appreciate if you'd help me out by either reading them out or letting me know. So being drawn in by this co-op sector as a way to sort of find relief from this psychological toll. Because for me, again, the co-op sector suddenly became this example of this workplace that offered that through the cooperative principles of democratic decision-making or collective ownership, through the values of equality, equity, solidarity, that those of us most impacted by discriminatory policies and behaviors at work, we could be the bosses and we can create workplaces that work for us. And it's not like that was, some pipe dream or some uncharted territory. And just give me a minute here to switch over to my next slide, because unfortunately, in accessing the chat, I lost my ability. Okay, I'm gonna quickly stop share and reshare. Just bear with me. I'm gonna try that again. And I think I'm gonna call on Benedict or Aishi for a bit of help because let's see what's going on here. Aishi, I think resharing would work. Let me try that. Okay, let's see. That's good. Hmm. Okay, can everyone see my screen okay again?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Wonderful, wonderful. All right. So I'm gonna drink my water. I hope I kept cool there in that bit of a technical flub. And while I drink my water, if you haven't read that piece from what I wrote on Instagram, take a minute to read it and we'll continue on. So these benefits that we see from co-ops, this idea that they can be this space that relieves BIPOC communities from that psychological toll, that space where we could bring our whole selves to work. It's not like that is some theory that hasn't been tested. This has literally been the ways in which BIPOC communities have utilized co-ops and cooperation throughout history. So this is from Jessica Gordon Nemhard, the book Collective Courage. And Dr. Nemhard, in this book, offers the first comprehensive view of the history of cooperative economics among Black communities. And here she's saying that Black Americans, as well as other people of color and low-income people from around the world, have benefited greatly from cooperative ownership and democratic economic participation. So what are those benefits? Dr. Nemhard expands on that. Let me give you a minute to just read that quote and soak it in. So here Dr. Nemhard is speaking about Black communities, but what's contained in that quote, the same could be said for a number of racialized communities. Let's take an example from Canada. The same could be said about Japanese communities and the role of Japanese Canadian fishing cooperatives up and down BC's coast at the beginning of the 20th century. That too was an alternative economic strategy to promote economic stability in the face of a fierce anti-Asian racism that led to economic exclusion, societal exclusion, and the denial of basic rights. So we know that co-ops are a means of resilience during economic crisis, right? It's one of the co-op advantages that we often hear of. But it's important to recognize that co-ops as a means of resilience during crisis hold a different set of meanings for racialized and marginalized communities, otherwise known as equity deserving communities. Because it's often those communities who are the most impacted by not only economic crises, but by the multiple crises that we face: climate crises, assaults on democracy, racial injustice, the precariousness of work, the lack of affordable housing. And we're in this moment where we're seeing those crises converge, and they've been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic, so that many more of us are now looking at these systems that cause that and going, we need an alternative. And so the co-op sector, it's well positioned to be that alternative that equity-seeking groups look to. And particularly for BIPOC communities, that's one of the key messages that the sector can communicate, that it could shine a spotlight on the ways in which cooperation has helped BIPOC communities navigate the multiple crises that we face. Yet the co-op sector in Canada doesn't largely tell that story, right? We don't see outreach to BIPOC communities with that messaging. We don't see these histories and examples of cooperation told prominently in the literature on co-ops or on the co-op development or educational resources, despite the fact that these are stories and narratives that have been researched and written about by academics such as Drs. Caroline Shanaz Hossain, or Joanne Lee. And, you know, we're at CASC, so please drop in the chat more academics doing this work on BIPOC co-ops in Canada so that we can continue to amplify their work. So I invite you to do that now, do it, you know, sharing that at the end of the presentation, because it's important that that message be communicated. And this is one of the shifts that I'm calling for. I'll be presenting at the Cooperative and Mutuals Canada Congress in June. And some of the content in that conference is going to be grappling with this question: are co-ops still relevant? And as I'm considering this topic, you know, I'm adding to that question. Is the cooperative movement in this country still relevant to racialized and marginalized communities? And in that, yes, I'm speaking about BIPOC communities, but I'm also speaking about 2S LGBTQIA+ communities, women and non-binary communities, disabled communities, because members from all of those communities are looking for a future of work that works for us, right? Alternatives that empower us rather than replicate the oppressive power dynamics and exclusion of our identities that we've experienced in the workforce. I'm a bit grappling with this question because I'm leaning toward no. The current co-op movement in this country isn't speaking in a relevant way to equity deserving communities. I mean, I look at my own example. I came into this sector really excited by these radically transformed workplaces that center equity and inclusion, and came upon a sector with predominantly white leadership, largely grappling with the same quantitative DEI issues that traditional businesses. And when that sort of numbers game of how do we get more BIPOC folk into the sector, as opposed to that qualitative work of actual equity inclusion. You have folks in the same room at the same table, and now we're working in solidarity to grapple with those issues and ensure that everyone has equal access. This is my freedom dream for Canada's co-op sector. And this is that sort of qualitative, let's get to the equity inclusion DEI that I was just speaking about. These are the words of Maurice Mitchell. And Maurice is the National Director of the Working Families Party in the US. And this was from his keynote, Maurice's keynote during the 2020 Worker Co-op Conference. I'm gonna read a bit more from what Maurice had to say. So organized labor in general and worker co-ops specifically are creating the conditions and modeling what it looks like, where a mass of people actually deal with the challenges and conflicts and contradictions that come with deciding how the workplace should be run. Those same skills of wrestling with those contradictions, of dealing with real conflict, real difference, and then coming together to resolve it every day, day in and day out, making decisions about how those workplaces best meet the needs for the many and not the privileged few at the top, is preparing working people to lead in all segments of life. The type of democracy you engage in daily can be scaled to transform society. What are the shifts that need to happen so we can create that kind of beautiful struggles, that we can create that kind of sector where equity deserving communities feel like they can bring their whole selves to this movement, where our communities and allies want to engage in this beautiful struggle together? I mean, understanding that transitioning from work cultures that prioritize whiteness at the expense of other identities to those that have a truly integrated DEI is going to be fraught with false stops and starts and mistakes, unequal emotional labor, while also requiring organizational restructuring, personal and professional development, ongoing commitment, and significant financial investment what might need to happen to create an environment that makes us feel welcomed and supported in doing this work, building trust and goodwill while breaking down unequal power structures. So that, yeah, we feel good about standing in solidarity with each other as we come up with these collective, what Maurice calls common sense solutions. So let's get into the actionables. This is one of the first mission statements I wrote for Freedom Dreams. I'm going to sip a bit of water and give you a moment to read those. So this idea of our community seeing ourselves reflected in the movement and that being a catalyst, you know, to create co-ops and cooperations that become reality. How does that done? I already alluded to that with the question of how is the co-op story being told? Because if BIPOC communities can't see how the sector is relevant to us, to the employment barriers that we face, to the discrimination that we experience, if we can't see this as a sector that has real answers and real transformative approaches to the urgent need to create economic stability, dignified work, to generate living wages within our communities, then what's the draw, right? Just saying democratic decision-making and collective ownership can quickly become rhetoric. You know, if we're not actually seeing the tangible impacts of that on the issues we face, if we're not actually seeing that work in action. And now I gave historical examples of that work, but I'm not just talking history. I'm talking about how we cooperate currently, because cooperation is alive in BIPOC communities. And, you know, I hear, you know, sort of the argument that the co-op model isn't well known in Canada across the board, and, you know, particularly among BIPOC communities. And I'm gonna challenge that. That's simply not true, right? Cooperation has deep roots within BIPOC communities, within communities across the diaspora in this country. And there needs to be a recognition of those ways in which we cooperate, even as they may not look like your formally incorporated co-ops. Here's an example of cooperation in BIPOC communities that is tied very tangibly into what cooperation means in terms of navigating the multiple crises that BIPOC communities face. These are the words of Mabinti, who's a member of a Toronto-based Rosca, and I'll give you a second to read that. Now, if you're not familiar with Roscas, they're a form of savings cooperative primarily practiced among women across the global South and, you know, within diasporas here in Canada. A lot of research and advocacy for this sector has been done by Dr. Carolyn Shanaz Hossain, who tells us that this form of cooperation has been practiced in Canada over the last 70 years as a way to counteract business exclusion. That part is important. You know, Roscas are a hidden form of co-op. And in this keynote, I'm talking to you about, you know, the ways in which BIPOC communities feel that they can't bring their whole selves to the workplace. Here's an example of when BIPOC communities feel that we can't bring our whole selves to society. You know, Roscas operate outside of mainstream view because they are an act of resistance against things like racism and discrimination in mainstream banking, against being underbanked, right? Against business exclusion. And I bring up this example and you might say, well, you know, this is something else. This isn't co-ops. This isn't cooperation, right? This is any number of things, but it's not your big C co-op. And so it's not within the scope of our concern. And I would argue that when you say that, when you hold that view, the sector misses opportunities to collaborate when it ignores the ways in which BIPOC communities already cooperate. Here's an example. This is the Black Women Professional Workers Co-op, an incorporated co-op that whose worker owners started out in a Rasta and actually raised some of their startup capital through that savings type of savings co-op. So now BWPW is part of the formal co-op sector and is building bridges with Rastas through their program, BWPW Co-op Rasta Plus. And I'll give you a second just to read some of the characteristics of this endeavor. It's innovations like this that can come about when the formal cooperative sector recognizes and works with the so-called informal cooperative sector. And I'm arguing that this is one of the most important cultural shifts the sector can make. Shifting the paradigm from, well, how can we over here pull more BIPOC communities into the co-op sector, to how can the co-op sector support cooperation already happening on the ground among BIPOC communities. Second actionable, what's the role of the co-op developer in all of this? Now, this is a slide that I used during a recent workshop I gave called Allyship and Equity in Cooperative Development for Co-op Zone, which is a national network of co-op developers. And I used it to make the argument that co-ops require something different from developers alongside the traditional role that the co-op developer holds, which you see along the side there. So what do I mean when I say co-ops require something different from developers? Well, as millennials and Gen Z, who are keenly aware of and activated by social justice issues, literally become the workforce. The future of work will be one that must actively and impactfully address issues like cultural inclusion, racial and gender equity, 2S LGBTQIA+ rights in the workplace, mental health, and even politics and social justice in both workplace culture and policy. And these are issues that, prior to had been thought taboo or inappropriate or uncomfortable to discuss at work. But the most successful businesses will be those that include these issues, not as off the side of workers' desks issues, but as core pillars of their organizational structures. We see these shifts happening now. So if co-ops are to be that alternative to capitalist exploitation and extraction, if they're going to be that sector that BIPOC communities, that equity deserving communities can look to and say, that's the sector where I can bring my whole self, then I'm arguing that co-op developers, that second tier cooperative organizations, our associations and our federations should include diversity, equity, and inclusion competencies as part of their toolkits. Startup co-ops or existing co-ops seeking to build businesses where equity and inclusion and social justice are core pillars of their organizational structures should be able to seek guidance from within the sector on how to tangibly do this. And I guess the question is, well, why? Why should co-ops, be this place where our co-ops and our membership can look in-house for this? Well, because it's literally the cooperative identity, right? Like a sector that has democracy, that has equality, equity, and solidarity literally baked within its core values and principles should be resourced, well-resourced with relevant and leading edge approaches on how co-ops can apply these values and principles to their everyday operations. Things like how community outreach can be authentic and ethically allied, how policy and procedures can be built or amended for an integrative DEI as opposed to DEI as an add-on. You know, how a culture of inclusion can become a working culture. As a sector, we can't just say this is what we stand for, but then have our co-ops sort of flailing around with, well, where do we go or what do we do, as they try to seek out how to operationalize equity and inclusion. I support the adoption of the 8th cooperative principle, which is diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I believe that to prepare us and strengthen us for that, DEI should actually be interwoven throughout all of the cooperative principles, so that the 8th principle doesn't itself just become this add-on. You know, there's been this image that's kind of been stuck in my mind, and it comes from Naki Zamisa, and he's the program director of House Ontario and of York University's nonprofit housing society cooperative in Toronto. And we were talking about these DEI efforts that we're seeing from companies and how they just feel superficial or performative, or they feel like they're just this second thought, you know, or were thought of in reaction, you know, to a publicized trauma in the news that racialized and marginalized groups have experienced. And he said, you know, it just kind of feels like these companies are trying to just bend themselves around DEI, which suggests like an inconvenient or an ill fit. But the co-op movement doesn't have to twist itself around to make DEI compatible with its aims. You know, in fact, as co-ops seek to operationalize DEI, I actually believe that a key piece of the cooperative advantage is being overlooked, and which is that DEI can be applied to every one of these principles. I mean, yes, you can make an obvious connection between DEI and voluntary and open membership, or you can make a connection between DEI and concern for community. But from my lived experience, I see DEI in every one of these, right? The same links exist for the other principles. So for example, to build democratic member control, you have to interrogate the ways that even consensus models, that even consensus-based decision-making can replicate oppressive power dynamics. And how do you overcome that? Or if you want to create cooperatives that build approaches for true member economic participation, you have to examine the ways that marginalized communities have experienced economic exclusion and the ways in which that impacts the willingness to engage in economic systems. And the ROSCA sector can very much take the lead there in teaching the co-op sector about that. Freedom Dreams is embarking on the creation of a toolkit that's doing exactly this, which is interpreting the co-op principles through an anti-oppression and cultural inclusion framework. And our goal with this toolkit is to help co-ops and credit unions integrate DEI practices that are in alignment with the cooperative identity. We believe that this is the work that both prepares us for and strengthens the adoption of the 8th principle, so that we're not building co-ops that are trying to bend themselves around DEI, but have DEI principles and practices integrated and interwoven throughout co-ops culture and policy informed by the cooperative identity. This is what I believe is that groundwork that has to be done in order to create those workplaces where members from equity deserving communities can feel like they could bring their whole selves to work when they cast a glance at the co-op sector, that they could see the co-op sector as that alternative, right? That permits that to happen, that is actively and in a in a spirit of joy and thriving doing this work, because it is part of that core identity of co-ops. And that's the message that needs to be highlighted. And so how do we do that? Just to quickly recap, tell an inclusive co-op story. Expand the co-op developers and second-tier co-op organizations toolkit to include DEI expertise. And let's start practicing the co-op principles, all of them, through a cultural inclusion and anti-oppression lens, so that as we continue speaking to this movement of an 8th co-op principle, you know, it doesn't just end up being one of those performative gestures, that it actually has deep and meaningful impact and reach within and for BIPOC communities. Thank you. Thank you for taking the time. If you want to reach out to us, we've got a brand new website, freedomdreamscoop.ca. You can follow what we're doing on Instagram and Facebook at Freedom Dreams Co-op. And if you want to reach out to me, my email's right there at the bottom. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Christine, for that wonderful presentation. It's very thought-provoking and joyful. It's great to read. Very provocative for the co-op movement as well, and which is good and needed. So I will just point out that Laurie Cook has put a number of points that people can read in terms of some other places to look. And there's a question here. I'd invite anyone who wishes to raise your hand with a little icon of reactions, if you don't know that yet, and I'll call on you as you are there. But I'll first start off by noting there is a question in the chat from Rejane Klassen, which is, can the core principles you speak of be transposed onto mainstream business enterprises and institutions to help shape their DEI frameworks? And if so, are there any examples of this knowledge sharing model?
It's a great question. You know, and at Freedom Dreams, we often talk about, you know, we'll often talk about co-ops and cooperative approaches, because we believe that those co-op principles and those ways of cooperation actually have a lot to say outside of the sector. I actually think that as even traditional business looks to ask these questions about how do we integrate DEI, I honestly think that traditional business should be looking at the co-op sector, right? We talk about, are co-ops still relevant? What co-ops stand for can have larger reaching implications to other types of businesses, right? Including traditional business, and the invitation to adopt cooperative approaches in various business models. So I do think that that work does have those far-reaching consequences. And I think the second half of that question was, are there any current, is that right, Hazel? Are there any current examples?
Are there any examples of that sort of approach?
Of this knowledge sharing model?
Yeah.
I mean, I would like to uplift Freedom Dreams. Are what we're attempting to do, even when we do workshops. We are not just doing them for, you know, your incorporated co-op. We just did a workshop this week for filmmakers and producers within the social impact sector, and they were very much interested in this idea of a cooperative framework in which they could do this social justice oriented work from a democratic decision making and collective model. So what we're doing, I believe, is an example of that, that work of knowledge sharing.
Thank you. So next up we have Judith Harris. Judith.
Thanks, Christine, so much to talk about, and apologies for my voice again. There's a group of families in Winnipeg's North End who have managed to have a campaign to build a childcare center in the North End. And they're called on by the province to establish a management committee and also to establish bylaws. And many people are really struggling with the kind of bylaws that are out there to use. This bylaw template that's there. It seems to be more about focusing on risk and you know, making sure that you're not going to be sued or anything. And so people really want to base their day-to-day operations on trust. And it's so hard to find any alternative model of bylaws that are more cooperative and that are, you know, maybe in keeping with feminist values and or culturally appropriate values. Just wondering if you have any thoughts on where people can go to see bylaws that guide you in operations that are, you know, more culturally appropriate and more in keeping with feminist and co-op values. Sorry about the voice.
No, it's okay. Thank you, Judith. And yeah, as much as you can, rest rest your voice from the laryngitis. I've come across this before, and the idea, are there existing models? I haven't come across them. I mean, I'm going to call on, you know, if Lori or Hazel has come across existing models that are of bylaws through intersectional lenses, because I would love to know. What I also always say, though, to this question is, you know, yes, there are the bylaws of the co-op, but that doesn't supersede, you know, the creation of more culturally relevant ways by which a co-op can organize itself, right? Whether that, you know, then gets reflected in the policies and procedures of the co-op, or whether that gets reflected in the day-to-day culture of how that co-op runs, right? That those things can also be written about or discussed or drawn or danced by the co-op, right? I always argue that you don't just have to be bound by the bylaws alone. Yes, that is that really like administrative and tedious process of, you know, incorporating as a co-op, but that doesn't mean that there can't also be made space for the cultural ways in which a co-op wants to express itself.
I would add to that as well. Thanks for that answer, Christine. But I think that also, to the degree the bylaws can lead the group toward more consensus-based decision models, which, you know, certainly there are examples of those kinds of bylaws out there as well, that really builds trust in the group more than other approaches, I think, to at least decision making. And also ways for dealing with conflict, that people, you know, understand they'll be able to do that and get through it and have a trust in a really solid process, which may not necessarily be written into bylaws, but more about policy. Did anybody else want to
I think I see Lori. Yeah, Lori, part of iMove, which is the organization that Lori works with, iMove's co-op learning project is to collect and analyze a range of co-op resources from a BIPOC perspective. We have over 120 now and have reviewed over 60 so far. And it would be great to see that as that work moves forward, Lori, if there's examples of bylaws that are more written through an intersectional lens.
And also, if it's possible, if those are available publicly on a website somewhere, you can maybe drop that in the chat, Lori. Go ahead, Christine. There's more answers in the chat as well.
Yes, so we've got Anna regarding different bylaws. There is the work of the Movimiento de Trabajadores in the city of Rosario, Argentina. These links are not, these are not talked about as being culturally responsive. They do not use that language, but they look to me like they are. So there is a great example. Do you have a link to that, Anna, that you could drop in the chat?
They don't have it on the website, but
Okay.
We've been working with them and we have written a couple of pieces, although they are written in Spanish. I could provide you the references and it'd be great. This is a great topic. Actually, I'm not sure whether I could speak. Sorry, maybe I'm
No, please.
imposing. Okay.
No.
Okay. This is a topic that has caught my interest for a long, long time because I had been a member of a co-op a long time ago. And at that point, the kind of bylaws we had were not very responsive to anything, I should say. So over time, this has become a topic of my interest in the collaborative research I do. And these small cooperatives in Rosario have created ways, for example, to represent workload within the cooperative with images of animals. So they do that as a humorous way to bring about topics that usually are very hard to talk about. And it would be very long for me to explain this all, but they've also created other articles in their bylaws, for example, to be responsive to the fact that some of them want to travel and want to be away, but they still want to be members of the co-op. So they made up an article by which if you're a member of the co-op and you leave the co-op, but you go through a learning experience by traveling, if you come back and share your knowledge, then you can still be a member, so on and so forth. Again, I'm not going to use up your time, but those are very interesting ways of being responsive, I think, although they do not use the language of being culturally responsive, which is interesting to me as well. Gracias.
Anna. Thank you.
That's great. And I just want to, like, Hazel, you said the idea of having this stuff publicly, posted and available. And, it's just, again, thinking of my own desire that there be a central hub, for this work. And, I think Lori, you mentioned the literature review that iMove is doing, but just planting that seed of that cooperation among cooperatives. Let's get a central hub of these resources going.
I'll just jump in and respond to that, what you just mentioned, Christine, because in terms of co-op development spaces and bylaw templates and so on, the original conception of co-op zone was that it would be that clearinghouse and those would all be there. And of late, that's not been the case. Hopefully that will shift back. And as far as research work, I mean, the folks who are CASC members and are present here would be able to point us better to where those spaces are. But I think on the research side, it does tend to exist better than it does for like the co-op development side and that kind of thing. I don't know if anyone wants to speak to that from CASC, just give a second, but there had been a research network, Canadian Research Network Hub, I don't know the exact name of it, that still exists, I'm sure. And Christine, I'll just leave you to keep going through the comments in the chat. Okay. I don't see other hands.
Tracy Wong, thank you, Tracy. So the question that I have is, how can individuals who benefit from the status quo be encouraged to recognize and implement co-op principles? I'm going to call from folks, if you self-identify as being part of that status quo, what would you commit to, or how would you answer that question?
I could take a stab at it. I think that what my organization, the Canadian Worker Co-op Federation, is seeking to do is to create a table at which BIPOC folks can be the leadership and or at minimum in the same conversation, including opening up 2 spaces for BIPOC advisors around our board, one of which is filled by a Métis man from Ontario and one of which we're still seeking a person for. I mean, I think it's harder in the larger, more established parts of the co-op sector where people tend to be pretty business oriented and focused and do see this in the same way I'm sorry to be critical, but they do see this in the same way that the traditional business world sees it, that it's like sort of off in its own little spot, in the corner or whatever, and it's an add-on and not integrated. I don't know how I guess I feel it's a personal challenge to try to figure out how we get more people in the co-op movement thinking these ways. And as far, that's my answer, I guess. If anyone else wants to jump in as well, you're welcome. There's no easy answer, obviously, but the way is through dialogue, of course, and sharing power. I mean, that's what it's about.
Thank you, Hazel. And okay, there's a lot in the chat, so I'm hoping I can get through. Lori, and save this chat, everybody, because Lori Cook is putting some great examples for resources that you can check out. Let's see, I'd like to hear more. Yes, please reach out to me via email, reach out to, I see folks in the chat asking they can reach out to each other via email, which is amazing. More from response in an innovative way. As I go through these chats too, also want to invite people, that question I asked about what is the place of co-ops in the future of work. If anyone wants to share some of what their reflections are, and particularly after the presentation, I'd love to hear it. Just also want to uplift that Lori is saying that CASC has a session. Yes, there's a session tomorrow, moderated by Lori, on ethical allyship tomorrow. So to answer that question about how can those, you know, who hold privilege that are part of the status quo be encouraged in this work, I think that I would also recommend going to Lori's session tomorrow on building ethical allyship. Okay, and that's at 2:30 Eastern, learning to be ethical allies, sharing lessons learned. Okay, Judith, can Roscas experience greater inclusion in the co-op movement without losing their informality and autonomy? I think that's a great question. And again, I don't want to speak. I'm in the, you know, Roscas has been a part of my childhood, and recognizing, you know, that, you know, my mother, my aunties had participated in Roscas. And I'm starting a Rosca with some of my girlfriends right now, but I don't speak for the sector. And so for that question, Judith, I want to direct you toward the work of Dr. Carolyn Shanaz Hossein to really dig deep into that work. Or BWPW Co-op, who's doing the Roscas Plus, I also want to uplift them too. Okay, thanks, Hazel. I think I've reached the bottom of the chat. So Hazel's saying there's a networking room as well for any who wish to continue the dialogue after. Okay.
I have a quick question for going forward, Christine, which is, does Freedom Dreams cooperative education have any, or do you have any future presentations, virtual presentations you could tell us about that are upcoming? In addition to, you mentioned you being in person at the CMC Congress, which of course can be virtual as well, but beyond that,
Yes.
what else?
Well, I'd also, so I spoke about this session that we did for a group of women, predominantly women and women identified documentary filmmakers and producers. That session is called Radically Transforming Work, where we lead groups using the cooperative principles and guided visualization and a lot of really interactive and dynamic elements to start thinking about, you know, how would you create that radically transformed workplace? And we've delivered that to that group. We've delivered it to youth as part of SEDNet's Create Action and the National Association of Friendship Centers Youth Programming. And we just invite folks to connect with us, because if you're looking for a way on, you know, how can we radically transform our organizations using those same co-op principles, reach out to us and let's talk about how we could customize that session for your group.
Excellent, that's great to know, and I will think about that, as I'm sure we all will. So thank you, Christine, for this awesome presentation, and we look forward to more dialogue with you and with others, including in the allyship session tomorrow. And I don't know whether it's possible for one of the tech folks to drop the networking room in the chat, but in a prior session I saw that done and thought it was helpful. Yeah, do you have any further closing comments, Christine, or anybody? I just thought it was a great dialogue and a great session, and it's really important space for the co-op movement to be engaged in. And by the way, if anyone's not aware, the ICA is currently embarking on its revision of the co-op principles. And there is a survey out through which anybody, any co-op and any individual, as long as you clarify how you're, on whose behalf you're responding, to give your input into how the co-op principles, the whole statement of co-op identity should be changed. And I know I personally have different views now than I had earlier as to how I want to answer this. I love the notion of building the JEDI DEI concepts into all the principles, as well as, there's a lot of pressure to add new principles, just to be clear, environment, BIPOC, JEDI, etc. But whether or not one gets added for any particular thing, I think that the JEDI lens needs to be added to all. And I'm going to do my best to all my whatever status quo I've got to try to use to get that message in, and I hope others will join. So thank you, everyone. And I see the networking session is in the chat. So before we get too many calls to stop and go on to new things, we'll wrap up. But thanks again, Christine, and everyone.
Thank you,
Wonderful.
Hazel.
Okay.
Thank you, Judith, and everyone at CASC for the invitation.
Thanks the interpreter and all the help from
Yes.
everyone. Okay, be
Yes,
well.
thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Yes,
Bye-bye.
bye.